I am Kiara, 35 years old, and my morning started with a phone call that was supposed to shatter my world. My sister Chantel called me at exactly 7:30 to announce with chilling absolute detachment that our father had died the night before. Before I could even process the cruelty in her voice, her husband Todd laughed in the background, loudly bragging that I was completely cut out of the estate and getting absolutely nothing. What they did not know was that I was not crying. Instead, I pressed the speakerphone button and slid my phone across the marble island of my kitchen toward the man sitting right next to me. My father, very much alive and calmly sipping his black coffee, leaned forward and silently mouthed the words, "Let them keep talking." Before I reveal exactly how we dismantled their greedy little empire piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who severely underestimated your intelligence. The morning had started quietly in my downtown Atlanta condo. I am a forensic accountant, which means my entire life is built around finding the truth, hidden in the numbers, tracing the lies people tell when they think no one is looking. I woke up early, brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, and was going over some files when my phone vibrated against the granite countertop. Seeing Chantel's name flash on the screen immediately put my guard up. Chantel is 32, the undisputed golden child of our family. A woman who has never worked a hard day in her life, but somehow always expects the world to be handed to her on a silver platter. She married Todd 2 years ago, a 34-year-old man who perfectly matches her sense of entitlement. Todd loves to play the brilliant entrepreneur, but his main source of income has always been my father's bank account. I answered the phone with a simple hello. There was no greeting on the other end, no softening of the blow. "Sis, Dad died last night," Chantel said. Her voice was completely devoid of grief. It sounded more like she was reading a business transaction. "He had a massive heart attack. It was too fast. The doctors could not do anything. He left everything to me and Todd. You get nothing." I felt a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. Not because of the news, but because of the sheer predatory nature of her tone. Then I heard Todd. His voice was muffled at first, like he was standing across the room, but he moved closer to the phone. "Tell her the house is ours," Todd said, a smirk clearly audible in his voice. "Finally, you are out of the picture, Kiara. No more splitting the pie." Wallace knew who really had his back. I did not say a word. I just looked across my kitchen island at my father, Wallace. He is 65 years old, a self-made man who built a massive real estate and logistics empire from nothing. He is a man who commands respect the second he walks into a room, a man who has provided for Chantel her entire life, despite her constant financial drain on his resources. As he listened to his oldest daughter and his white son-in-law gleefully celebrate his supposed death, I watched a profound transformation happen on his face. The initial shock melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He set his coffee mug down without making a single sound. He pointed a finger at the phone and gave me a sharp nod, signaling me to wrap it up without giving anything away. I took a steady breath, making sure my voice sounded suitably subdued. "I understand," I said quietly into the receiver. I did not ask about funeral arrangements. I did not ask which hospital they were at. I just let the silence hang for a second before Chantel replied. "We will be in touch about retrieving any of his personal effects if we decide to release them to you. Goodbye, Kiara." The line went dead. I set the phone down and looked at my father. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. Wallace leaned back in his bar stool, staring at the blank screen of my phone. He rubbed his jaw, shaking his head slowly. "They did not even wait 24 hours, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They think I am lying on a slab in a morgue somewhere, and their first instinct is to call you and gloat about the money." "They did not even bother to fake a single tear," I pointed out, pouring him another cup of coffee. "I am sorry, Dad. I really am." My father waved off the apology. "Do not be sorry for me, Kiara. Be sorry for them because they have absolutely no idea what is about to hit them. To understand the sheer audacity of Chantel and Todd, you have to know what happened 12 hours earlier." The reality of the previous night was far more sinister than a simple family tragedy. Around 8 o'clock the previous evening, my father had been at his estate in Buckhead, having dinner with Chantel and Todd. They had come over uninvited, likely to ask for another massive loan to cover Todd's failing business ventures. During dinner, my father started experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath. He collapsed in his dining room. Chantel did call an ambulance. I will give her credit for that bare minimum of human decency. But what happened next was unforgivable. They rode behind the ambulance to Emory Hospital, waited just long enough for the emergency room doctors to wheel him behind the double doors, and then they left. They did not stay in the waiting room. They did not wait to speak to a cardiologist. They took one look at my father unconscious on a stretcher, assumed he was not going to make it through the night, and sped right back to his estate. They did not know that my father had secretly updated his medical directives 2 years ago. I am his primary medical proxy, not Chantel. As soon as the hospital admitted him, my phone went off. I rushed to the hospital in a panic, expecting the worst. When I got there, the doctors told me it was a mild cardiac event. Serious, yes, but highly treatable. They had stabilized him quickly, and within 2 hours he was sitting up in bed, conscious and lucid. When I walked into his hospital room, his first question was where Chantel was. I had to tell him that she was not in the waiting room. The nurses confirmed that the couple who brought him in had left almost immediately without leaving a contact number. My father grabbed his cell phone and checked his home security cameras through his app. What we saw made my blood run cold. The live feed from his Buckhead estate showed Chantel and Todd walking through his private study. They were not crying. They were drinking his expensive scotch. Todd was actively pulling files out of my father's desk, while Chantel was walking around pointing at valuable pieces of artwork, literally claiming items she wanted to sell. We watched them in real time as they began searching for the combination to his wall safe. They were looting his house while they thought his body was turning cold in a hospital bed. Right then and there, lying in that hospital bed, my father made a decision that would change our family dynamic forever. He looked at me, his eyes harder than I had ever seen them. "Get me out of here, Kiara," he had commanded. "Do not tell them I survived. Do not tell anyone." Using my authority as his medical proxy, I arranged for a private medical transport. I had him quietly discharged and moved to an exclusive, highly discreet concierge recovery clinic across town for a few hours of observation to ensure his vitals were perfectly stable. Once the private doctors cleared him, I brought him straight to my condo in the early hours of the morning. I set up the guest room for him, making sure he was comfortable and safe. We spent the rest of the night talking, planning and waiting for the inevitable phone call we knew Chantel would make. And now, sitting in my kitchen, that call had finally come. The trap was officially set. My father took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. "Todd actually thinks he is going to step into my shoes," he said, a bitter laugh escaping his chest. "A man who has bankrupted 3 startups thinks he is going to take over a logistics empire. He thinks because he married my daughter he automatically inherited my crown. And Chantel is going to let him try," I added, opening my laptop. "She has always wanted the lifestyle without doing the work. If Todd convinces her he can run the company, she will sign over whatever proxy power she thinks she has, just to keep the money flowing." My father stood up, his posture rigid and authoritative despite the medical scare the night before. "I want to see everything they do, Kiara. I want you to use every skill you have. Trace their movements, monitor the corporate accounts, watch the estate security feeds. I want to know exactly how far they are willing to go to steal what is mine." I smiled, my fingers already flying across the keyboard. "You got it, Dad. By the time we are done, they will wish you really had died." I logged into my secure network, bypassing the standard firewalls to access the internal systems of my father's company. As a forensic accountant, my specialty is unearthing financial deception. People lie, but numbers never do. Chantel and Todd thought they were dealing with a grieving sister who was too emotionally devastated to fight back. They thought I would quietly accept being pushed out of the family legacy. They had severely underestimated the bond between my father and me, and they had completely misjudged my capacity for ruthlessness when it comes to protecting the people I love. "We are going to let them think they have won," my father said, walking up behind me to look at the screen. "We are going to let them sit in my chair, try to spend my money, and expose every single person in our circle who helps them do it. We are going to smoke out all the rats at once." I pulled up the bank monitoring software, watching the live activity on Chantel and Todd's joint accounts. Then I pulled up the social media feeds. It was time to watch the golden child and her arrogant husband hang themselves with their own greed. The show was just beginning, and we had the best seats in the house. I dragged my secondary monitor closer across the kitchen island, splitting the screen between my forensic tracking software and our family's social media feeds. It took exactly 42 minutes from the time Chantel hung up on me for the digital mourning to begin. I watched the notification pop up on my screen. Chantel had posted a carousel of photos. The first was a high-resolution, professionally edited picture of her and my father from her wedding day. The caption was an absolute masterpiece of performative grief. "My heart is shattered into a million pieces," she wrote, complete with a broken heart and a dove emoji. "Last night, heaven gained its strongest angel. My father, my rock, the patriarch of our family, was taken from us far too soon. Todd and I were by his side until his very last breath, holding his hand as he crossed over. Please respect our privacy as we navigate this unimaginable loss." I read the caption aloud, my voice steady but thick with disgust. Beside me, my father let out a harsh, humorless laugh. By his side until his very last breath, he repeated, staring at the screen. They left me in the emergency room hallway while the triage nurse was still hooking up my monitor. They did not even wait to see if my heart rate stabilized. I scrolled down to the comments section. The notifications were pouring in by the hundreds. Atlanta's social elite, members of my mother's old sorority, prominent church leaders, and local politicians were all offering their deepest condolences. Chantel was responding to almost every single one within seconds, soaking up the attention like a sponge. She was not grieving a father. She was hosting a digital red carpet event where she was the tragic, beautiful star of the show, while Chantel was securing her social status as the grieving heiress. Todd was making his moves on the corporate chessboard. I switched my focus to the secondary monitor. As the primary forensic auditor for my father's enterprise, Vanguard Logistics, I had top-tier administrative access to the company's internal communications network. I bypassed the standard employee portals and tapped directly into the executive voice over IP logs. Todd had wasted absolutely no time. Within an hour of their morning phone call to me, Todd was dialing the direct extensions of Vanguard's senior vice presidents. I routed the audio logs through my secure server, hit play, and let the recordings fill my kitchen. We listened to Todd's voice, smooth, authoritative, and dripping with an unearned sense of ownership. He was speaking to Calvin, Vanguard's chief operating officer and one of my father's most trusted friends. "Calvin, Todd," here the recording played. "I know this is incredibly sudden, and we are all devastated. Wallace was a titan. But as you know, in times of crisis, the market looks for stability. Chantel is completely beside herself, so I am stepping in to handle the transitional leadership. We cannot let Vanguard look weak or rudderless right now. I will be coming into the headquarters this afternoon to address the executive board and reassure the shareholders that everything is under strict control." My father gripped the edge of the marble island, the veins in his forearms pressed against his skin. Todd was 34 years old. He had bankrupted a boutique marketing firm, failed at a crypto startup, and currently ran a consulting agency that existed entirely on paper. Now this arrogant white man was calling a seasoned black executive with 30 years of logistics experience, acting as if he was the only one capable of steering a multi-million-dollar enterprise out of a crisis. The savior complex was sickening. Vanguard Logistics was a cornerstone of black wealth in Atlanta. My father built it from a single delivery truck into a regional empire. Todd was bypassing the entire corporate structure, stepping over highly qualified black executives and attempting to position himself as the great white hope rushing in to save the company from collapsing. He was using my father's supposed death as a backdoor to claim the success he could never build for himself. Calvin, to his credit, sounded highly skeptical on the recording. "Todd, with all due respect, The board has succession protocols for a reason, Calvin replied. And I have not heard a word from Kiara or the legal team yet. Kiara is not involved in the business operations, Todd fired back smoothly. Wallace left the estate in Chantel's hands and by extension mine. We need to freeze all major expenditures and halt the upcoming fleet expansion until I can personally review the financials. I need you to grant me temporary administrative access to the corporate accounts by noon. I paused the recording. The silence in the condo was heavy. Todd was not just trying to play boss. He was actively trying to lock down the company's cash flow. He wanted his hands on the capital before anyone could verify the legalities of his claims. They are moving faster than I anticipated, I said, pulling up Vanguard's banking portal. If Calvin caves to the pressure and grants him administrative access, Todd could reroute millions into offshore holding accounts before the end of the business day. He could bleed the company dry and claim it was necessary for corporate restructuring. My father stood up, pacing the length of my kitchen. His imposing frame cast a long shadow across the hardwood floors. He looked healthy, vibrant, and incredibly dangerous. Lock him out, my father commanded. Lock them both out of everything. I shook my head, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Not yet, Dad. If I lock him out right now, he will know someone with administrative power is actively fighting him. He will suspect you left a digital dead switch, or worse, he will realize I am onto him, and he will start hiding his tracks. We need him to feel confident. We need him to think he has the keys to the kingdom. I opened a back door in the company's financial software. Instead of blocking Todd, I created a shadow account. I mirrored the corporate interface perfectly. If Calvin granted him access, Todd would log in and see exactly what he wanted to see: massive account balances and full operational control. But it would be a sandbox, a simulated environment. He would be able to issue transfer commands, sign digital checks, and authorize expenditures, but none of it would actually execute. Instead, every single move he made would be routed directly to my secure server, creating a permanent time-stamped record of attempted corporate theft. You are building him a glass house, my father said, a slow, predatory smile finally breaking through his anger. Exactly, I replied. I am giving him enough rope to hang himself. Every dollar he tries to move, every asset he attempts to liquidate will be documented as federal wire fraud. I watched the incoming traffic on the server. Sure enough, Calvin had reluctantly generated a temporary guest executive credential for Todd, likely to avoid a messy public confrontation while he tried to verify the news of my father's death with our legal team. The second Todd's IP address logged into the shadow portal, the tracking software lit up like a Christmas tree. Look at this, I said, pointing to the screen. He is not even looking at the operational budgets or the payroll accounts. He bypassed the logistics division entirely. Where is he going? My father asked, leaning over my shoulder. He is heading straight for the philanthropic division. He is looking at your community foundation accounts. My father's charity foundation provided full-ride scholarships to local college students and funded small business grants for minority entrepreneurs in South Atlanta. It held millions in liquid assets specifically designated for community development. Todd was ignoring the core business and heading straight for the charitable cash reserves. He wants liquid capital, I observed, tracking his cursor movements through the shadow portal, and he wants it fast. You do not raid a charity fund to stabilize a logistics company. You raid a charity fund because you owe someone a lot of money and they are demanding payment right now. My father's eyes darkened. Find out who he owes Kiara. Dig into every single account he has ever touched. I cracked my knuckles and dragged a new window onto the screen. I was already running a deep background diagnostic on Todd's personal finances, bypassing his encrypted drives. It was time to see exactly how much debt the golden child's perfect husband was really hiding. I opened a secure terminal running a trace on Todd's social security number and corporate tax ID, but before the progress bar could even hit 20%, a blaring red notification flashed across my primary monitor. This was not an alert from Vanguard Logistics. This alert was coming directly from the encrypted banking portal of my own company, Apex Forensic Accounting. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I read the incoming message from my commercial bank. An external request had just been submitted to freeze my firm's primary operating accounts and suspend my commercial line of credit. The authorization code attached to the request belonged to Vanguard Logistics. I let out a breath that was half shock, half genuine amusement. My father leaned over the island, his brow furrowing as he read the screen. He asked what Todd was doing now. "Hi is coming after my money," I said, pulling up the document cash attached to the freeze request. "Todd is actually trying to lock me out of my own firm." My father's expression tightened into a lethal glare. He demanded to know how that was possible, considering Apex is a completely independent limited liability company, and Vanguard has absolutely no legal ties to my business. I opened the digital file that Todd had blindly submitted to my corporate bank. It was a scanned copy of a collateral agreement. According to this paperwork, Vanguard Logistics had provided the initial $200,000 seed capital to launch my accounting firm 5 years ago. The document claimed that because my business was leveraged by my father's company, my operating accounts were now subject to probate under the estate. At the bottom of the page, supposedly verifying this fictional loan, was my father's signature. I zoomed in on the signature, shaking my head. It was a clumsy digital splice. Todd had lifted my father's signature from an old Vanguard shareholder report and slapped it onto a fabricated loan agreement. He had absolutely no idea how commercial banking worked. He assumed that because Chantel had spent her entire adult life treating my father's bank accounts like her personal automated teller machine, I must have done the exact same thing. Todd operates under the assumption that black wealth only flows in one direction. I told my father, my fingers flying across the keyboard to initiate a counter protocol. He cannot fathom that a black woman could build a seven-figure accounting firm completely on her own. He thinks I am just like Chantel, entirely dependent on your wallet. My father looked away, a heavy shadow passing over his face. "That is my fault, Kiara," he said. I created this monster. I let Chantel believe she was entitled to everything without having to build anything. It was the painful truth, the elephant that had lived in our family for over 3 decades. Growing up, the dynamic was impossible to ignore. Chantel was the golden child, the one whose charm and striking looks allowed her to glide through life without consequence. When she wrecked her first car at 19, my father bought her a brand new Mercedes the very next week. When she dropped out of her master's program to become an influencer, he quietly paid off her luxury apartment lease so her credit would not be ruined. He funded her lavish destination wedding to Todd, a man who contributed nothing but an inflated ego and a hollow resume. I, on the other hand, was the workhorse, the practical one. The daughter who was expected to be resilient, to figure it out, to never ask for a handout. When I needed capital to start my forensic accounting firm, I did not ask my father for a single dime. I knew the lecture I would get about proving my business model and mitigating risk. Instead, I worked 80-hour weeks at a corporate firm, lived in a tiny studio, and saved every single cent until I could lease my own office space. I built Apex Forensics brick by brick, client by client, until I was managing audits for some of the biggest corporations in Atlanta. My wealth was my own, untouchable and ironclad. And now this arrogant fraud thought he could just send a fabricated digital document to my bank and seize my life's work. I did not panic. I simply picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to my private banker, Marcus. Unlike Todd, I did not need to submit generic web forms or wait in a customer service queue. "When you manage the kind of capital I do, your bank answers on the first ring." "Marcus," I said the moment he picked up, "I need you to look at the freeze request that just hit the Apex commercial accounts." "I am looking at it right now," Kiara, Marcus replied, his tone laced with professional concern. "The authorization claims Vanguard Logistics is the primary stakeholder. We were about to call you to verify. The documentation looks highly irregular." "It is completely fraudulent," I stated clearly, projecting my voice so my father could hear every word. "I want you to reject the freeze request immediately, but do not just decline it. I want you to flag the submission for suspected wire fraud and forward the IP address data attached to the request directly to the bank's fraud investigation department." "Understood," Marcus said without hesitation. "The request is denied, and the submitting party's credentials are being locked and flagged for review. Your accounts are fully secure. Is there anything else you need from us today?" "Not right now. Thank you, Marcus." I hung up the phone and set it on the marble counter. My father was watching me, a look of profound respect softening the hard lines of his face. "You handled that like a veteran," he said quietly. "You built a fortress, Kiara. They cannot touch you." I smiled, turning back to my monitors. Todd thought he was playing chess, but he did not even know how to set up the board. By submitting that forged document to a federally insured bank, he had just committed a felony. He thought he was locking down my resources, but all he had done was hand me the first piece of concrete evidence I needed to put him in a federal prison cell. I watched the shadow portal I had built for Todd. A few seconds after my conversation with Marcus, Todd's simulated dashboard flashed a harsh error code. "Access denied. Fraudulent documentation detected." I could perfectly imagine the scene playing out at my father's estate in Buckhead. Todd staring at his screen in disbelief, the color draining from his face as he realized his quick cash grab had failed instantly. He needed capital desperately. My background trace was finally rendering, and the numbers populating on my screen were staggering. Todd was drowning in over $500,000 of toxic debt, mostly owed to offshore sports betting syndicates and high-interest private lenders. I was backed into a corner, and desperate men make sloppy mistakes. Since he could not break into my fortress, I knew exactly what he and Chantel would do next. They would try to control the narrative. If they could not steal my money, they would try to destroy my reputation. They would use the only currency Chantel had ever truly mastered: social manipulation and family politics. My phone began to vibrate steadily against the counter. It was not a client. It was not the bank. It was our Aunt Beatrice. And right beneath her name, a text message rolled in from my cousin Jamal. The flying monkeys were being deployed. Chantel had unleashed the extended family to do her dirty work, framing herself as the victim, and me as the cold, unfeeling villain who was abandoning her sister in a time of profound tragedy. My father looked in the glowing screen of my phone, his jaw tightening. "Do not answer it," he warned. "They are going to try to bait you." I picked up the phone, swiping away the notifications with a calm, deliberate motion. "I know, Dad. I am going to let them say whatever they want. Every voicemail they leave, every text they send, is just going to make the final reveal that much sweeter." Todd had failed his first direct financial attack, and now they were shifting to psychological warfare. But they forgot one crucial detail. You cannot manipulate a forensic accountant with emotional guilt. I live in the evidence, and the evidence was piling up faster than they could ever hope to hide it. The phone buzzed against the granite countertop with the relentless urgency of a swarm of angry hornets. I stared at the caller identification flashing across the screen. Aunt Beatrice. She was my father's older sister, the self-appointed matriarch of our extended family, and a woman who wielded her position in our Atlanta social circle like a blunt instrument. Right beneath her incoming call, a series of long text messages from my cousin Jamal began stacking up on my lock screen. The deployment of the flying monkeys had officially begun. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I let it vibrate, the harsh buzzing sound filling the quiet space of my kitchen, standing in stark contrast to the silent, damning numbers cascading across my computer monitors. I took a slow breath, centering myself. In my line of work, composure is a weapon. You let the target speak. You let them fill the silence with their own guilt. My father sat perfectly still on his bar stool. He watched the phone with a heavy, unreadable expression. He gave me a single definitive nod. I picked up the device, tapped the green accept button, and immediately pressed speakerphone so her voice would carry across the marble island. "Where are you, Kiara?" Aunt Beatrice demanded. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was holding up after receiving the news of my father's passing. Her voice was sharp, laced with an aggressive, performative indignation that she had perfected over decades of church board meetings and country club luncheons. "I am at my condo, Auntie," I replied smoothly. My tone was flat, offering her absolutely nothing she could use against me. "At your condo?" Aunt Beatrice scoffed, the sound dripping with absolute disdain. "Your father passed away last night. Your sister is currently at his estate, completely falling apart. She is practically inconsolable, weeping in her husband's arms, and you are sitting comfortably in your condo. You did not even have the decency to rush to the hospital when they called the ambulance." I looked across the island at my father. He closed his eyes for a brief second, shaking his head. We both knew the truth. Chantel and Todd had abandoned him in the emergency room hallway. But Chantel had clearly spun a magnificent tragic narrative for the extended family, painting herself as the devoted daughter who stayed by his side until the very end, while casting me as the cold absentee sister who could not be bothered to show up. "I am processing the news in my own way," I said, evenly sticking to the script. "Processing," Aunt Beatrice repeated, her voice rising an octave. "You have always been a cold, calculating machine, Kiara. You treat this family like an audit. Chantel needs her older sister right now. Todd is trying to manage the entire estate, dealing with the logistics company, handling the funeral home arrangements, and taking care of his devastated wife. That white boy is doing the job of a blood relative while you sit at home nursing your lifelong jealousy." The accusation hung in the air. Jealousy. It was the eternal narrative our extended family had assigned to me since I was a teenager. Because I did not conform to their performative standards, because I did not flatter and beg for scraps of my father's wealth, they decided I was bitter. They decided my independence was actually resentment. "You have always been jealous of her," Aunt Beatrice continued her tirade, picking up momentum. "Your father gave you everything. He paid for your education. He gave you a name that carries weight in this city, and you repay him by abandoning his favorite child in her darkest hour. You never could stand the fact that Chantel was the light of his life. You need to get in your car, drive to Buckhead, and support the man who is actually trying to keep this family from falling apart." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I knew that anything I said would be immediately twisted and fed straight back to Chantel. "I hear you, Auntie," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not just hear me, Kiara. Fix your attitude and get over there," she snapped. "We are holding a family prayer circle at the house this evening. I expect to see you there, showing some actual gratitude for the life your father provided for you." She disconnected the call with a sharp click. The silence rushed back into my kitchen, heavy and suffocating. I set the phone down face up on the counter. I did not look at my father right away. I busied myself by organizing the loose financial documents next to my keyboard, giving him the space to process what he had just heard. For my entire life, my father had generously funded Aunt Beatrice's lifestyle. He paid off her mortgage. He funded Jamal's multiple failed business ventures. He was the bankroll for the entire family tree. And the moment they thought he was dead, they did not mourn him. They immediately rallied behind the two people who they believed controlled his checkbook. They were violently defending Chantel and Todd because they needed the money train to keep running. My phone chimed loudly, interrupting the silence. An audio message had just downloaded from Jamal. I tapped the screen and let my cousin's voice play on the speaker. "Yo, Kiara." Jamal's voice echoed, sounding overly casual but dripping with condescension. "Mom just told me you are dodging Chantel. Look, I get it. You and Uncle Wallace had your differences because you always had to do things the hard way. But Todd is holding it down for the legacy right now. He is talking to the board, making sure the logistics company does not tank. You need to drop the Independent Strong Black Woman Act for 5 minutes, swallow your pride, and back Todd up. We need a united front to secure the bag. Call me back." I swiped the audio message away and locked the screen. The disrespect was breathtaking. Jamal, a man who had never held a steady job in his adult life, was lecturing me about securing a legacy that I had actively helped my father audit and protect for the last 10 years. He was demanding that I bow down to Todd, a known corporate failure, simply because Todd was holding the perceived keys to the vault. I finally looked up at my father. He was staring at the blank wall across the room. The physical toll of the last 12 hours seemed to have finally caught up with him, but it was not physical exhaustion I saw in his eyes. It was profound, shattering heartbreak. He had built a multi-million-dollar empire to lift his family out of generational poverty. He had provided homes, tuitions, luxury cars, and endless safety nets. He thought he was building a legacy of Black excellence. Instead, he realized he had built an ecosystem of parasites. They did not love him. They loved what he provided. And the only person who actually cared about his life, the daughter sitting right in front of him, was the one they collectively despised because she refused to join their ranks. "They called you cold," my father said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "They called you jealous." "It is just noise, Dad," I said, gently pushing the laptop slightly to the side. "I do not care what Aunt Beatrice or Jamal think about me. I never have." My father turned his head, locking his dark eyes onto mine. The heartbreak in his expression was rapidly cooling, solidifying into something terrifyingly sharp. He was a man who had survived the most cutthroat corporate environments in the country. You do not build a logistics empire without knowing how to ruthlessly eliminate liabilities. I watched the father I knew fade away, replaced entirely by the CEO. I cared, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I paid for Beatrice's life. I wiped out Jamal's debts twice. I let them sit at my table, and the second I am gone, they throw you to the wolves to protect a white man who is actively trying to rob us blind. He stood up from the bar stool. He did not look like a man recovering from a cardiac event. He looked like a general preparing for a massacre. Let them have their prayer circle, my father commanded, pointing a rigid finger at my monitors. Let Jamal kiss Todd's ring. Let Beatrice sing Chantel's praises. They want to align themselves with thieves. They want to push you out. Fine. He walked around the island, placing a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. We are going to burn the whole tree down, Kiara. I want you to freeze nothing. I want you to document everything. When we step into the light, I am not just taking my company back. I am wiping out every single safety net I ever built for them. I looked up at him, feeling a fierce, protective pride surge through my chest. The Golden Child thought she had won the war by declaring victory before the battle even started. She deployed her flying monkeys to keep me in line, assuming the scapegoat would just bow her head and take the abuse as she always had. But Chantel made a fatal miscalculation. She forgot that I am a forensic accountant. I do not fight with emotions. I fight with evidence. And standing right behind me was the architect of the very empire she was trying to steal, ready to help me tear her entire world apart. The sharp buzz of the lobby intercom shattered the momentary quiet in my condo. I walked over to the wall panel and pressed the speaker button. My concierge, a usually cheerful older man named David, sounded tense. He told me there was a priority courier in the lobby insisting on a direct delivery requiring my physical signature. I authorized the elevator access and walked back to the kitchen island. My father watched me, his dark eyes tracking my movements. We both knew the delivery was not a coincidence. Todd and Chantel were accelerating their timeline. A firm knock echoed through the foyer. I opened my front door to find a courier in a crisp uniform holding a thick, rigid manila envelope. I signed the electronic clipboard, took the package, and locked the deadbolt behind me. The return address printed in the upper left corner belonged to Todd's shell consulting firm. I carried the envelope back to the kitchen island and grabbed a stainless steel letter opener. I slid the blade under the flap and pulled out a stack of heavy, legal-sized paper bound by a thick brass clip. I laid the documents flat on the marble counter so my father and I could read them together. The top page was a formal notice to vacate. My eyes scanned the bold print. It was a legally phrased demand, ordering me to surrender the keys and vacate my own home within 30 days. The sheer audacity of the document made my pulse jump, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Read the justification, my father commanded, pointing a rigid finger at the second paragraph of the notice. I read the text aloud. The document stated that this property was purchased using misappropriated commercial funds belonging to Vanguard Logistics. It claimed that as an asset of the estate, the property was subject to immediate seizure by the sole executor for liquidation and redistribution. Todd actually believes he can throw me out onto the street, I said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping my throat. He thinks he can seize a property I bought and paid for with my own money. Flip to the next document, my father said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. Let us see exactly how he crowned himself the king of my empire. I flipped the heavy legal pages over. Beneath the eviction notice was a document titled, The Last Will and Testament of Wallace. The date printed at the top claimed it had been drafted and executed 6 months ago. I skimmed the legal jargon. It was a complete dismantling of everything my father had actually built. The forged document explicitly revoked all prior wills. It named Todd as the sole and absolute executor of the estate, granting him unchecked administrative power over Vanguard Logistics, the philanthropic foundation, and all private real estate holdings. Chantel was named as the sole financial beneficiary. My name appeared exactly once in a single vindictive clause stating I was entirely disinherited due to severe financial discrepancies and breaches of familial trust. My father gripped the edge of the marble island so hard his knuckles turned ash gray. I have used the same estate attorney for 20 years, he said, his voice trembling with a barely contained rage. Malik built my trusts. Malik secured my legacy. Todd actually thinks he can bypass a bulldog like Malik with a poorly drafted piece of paper printed from a cheap online legal template. Todd is arrogant, I replied, carefully separating the pages. And arrogant men always leave a trail. He thinks he can outsmart us because he operates under the delusion of his own superiority. He assumes that because I am a black woman, I will just panic when I receive a legal threat. He thinks I will pack my bags and walk away intimidated. He completely forgot what I do for a living. I did not shed a single tear over the eviction notice. I did not yell. I went straight to my home office and returned to the kitchen with a portable high-resolution scanner and a specialized ultraviolet light tool I use for physical document verification. I plugged the scanner directly into my encrypted server. "What are you looking for?" my father asked, watching my demeanor shift from a targeted sister to a surgical forensic accountant. "I am looking for the arrogance," I answered smoothly. I took the final page of the forged will, the one containing my father's supposed signature and a notary stamp, and slid it into the scanner. Within seconds, a high-definition digital replica appeared on my primary monitor. "First, let us look at the notary," I said, zooming in on the circular ink stamp at the bottom of the page. The stamp belonged to an independent notary public based in a small suburb outside of Atlanta. I opened a new browser window and accessed the state's digital notary database. I typed in the commission number visible on the stamp. The system returned a blaring red flag. The commission for this specific notary had expired 3 years ago. Todd had either found an old stamp in a drawer somewhere or paid a desperate unlicensed individual to stamp a fraudulent document. That was a felony all on its own. Next, I pulled out the ultraviolet tool and shined the purple light across the physical paper. I leaned in close, inspecting the blank spaces between the typed paragraphs. "Printer steganography," I explained, pointing to tiny, almost invisible yellow dots illuminated by the UV light. Every modern commercial printer leaves a microscopic pattern of yellow tracking dots on every single page it prints. It is a machine identification code. It encodes the exact serial number of the printer, as well as the specific date and time the document was printed. I ran the scanned image through a decryption software tool designed specifically to read those yellow dots. The progress bar flashed across my screen, decoding the microscopic pattern. A moment later, the results populated in a neat digital table. I looked up at my father, a cold smile forming on my face. "Todd backdated this will to make it look like you signed it 6 months ago. But the machine identification code proves this exact piece of paper was printed this morning at 8:15. It was printed from a commercial laser jet registered to Todd's fake consulting firm. He printed his own forged will 45 minutes after Chantel called to tell me you were dead." My father let out a slow, deliberate breath. He literally manufactured the weapon that is going to put him in a federal penitentiary. He did. I confirmed, saving the decryption report to an encrypted external drive. But he did not stop there. He went after my home, which means I am going to completely obliterate his financial credibility. I minimized the forged will and opened my secure commercial banking portal. I navigated to my personal real estate files. I pulled up the closing disclosure, the warranty deed, and the original wire transfer receipt from when I purchased my condo 5 years ago. "Todd claimed Vanguard Logistics provided the funds for this property," I said, dragging the banking records onto the shared screen. "But numbers do not lie. I bought this condo using a massive performance bonus I received after uncovering a corporate embezzlement ring for a Fortune 500 client. The wire transfer came directly from Apex Forensic Accounting. There is absolutely zero financial crossover between my property and Vanguard Logistics. Todd completely fabricated the corporate asset claim to legally harass me by sending an eviction notice through a licensed courier service based on forged legal documents. Todd had escalated his crimes to include mail fraud and attempted extortion. He was stacking federal offenses like building blocks. He thought he was systematically cutting off my resources, but all he was doing was building a pristine, undeniable chain of evidence that led directly back to his own keyboard. I watched my father stare at the digital evidence. He was a man who had faced down aggressive corporate raiders, survived economic downturns, and outmaneuvered cutthroat competitors. Yet the betrayal of his own flesh and blood hit differently. Chantel had given her husband the green light to leave her own sister homeless. She had authorized an attack that was designed to completely destroy my life. "They are trying to erase you," my father said quietly. "They are trying to wipe out everything you built so they can take everything I built." I reached across the island and placed my hand over his. "They are going to fail," I promised him, my voice steady and absolute. "Todd thinks he holds all the cards because he has a piece of paper with a fake signature. But he stepped into my arena today. He challenged a forensic accountant to a paper trail war." I turned back to my monitors and began compiling the evidence into a secure digital dossier. I uploaded the expired notary registry, the printer steganography report, my actual property deed, and the wire transfer records. Every single lie Todd had committed to paper was now mathematically and legally disproven. I was not just building a defense, I was building a cage. I did not call Todd to scream at him. I did not text Chantel to beg for my home. I simply categorized the felonies and prepared the legal snare. They wanted to play a game of corporate theft and family betrayal. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you try to audit the auditor. I shifted my focus back to the primary monitor, pulling up the live security feed from the executive boardroom at Vanguard Logistics. I had installed hidden audio-visual protocols in that room years ago during a routine security audit, knowing that corporate espionage often started from the inside. Today, the enemy was sitting right at the head of the table. The high-definition camera gave us a perfect view. Chantel was wearing a stark black designer dress, her face carefully made up to look exhausted and tear-stained. She sat in my father's custom leather chair, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while the senior executives filed into the room. Calvin, the chief operating officer, took his seat to her right. He looked genuinely devastated, his shoulders heavy with the weight of losing his mentor and friend. Todd stood at the front of the room, adjusting his suit jacket. He had positioned himself perfectly, projecting the false authority of a seasoned leader stepping into the breach. My father watched the screen from the kitchen island, his jaw clamped so tight I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Let us begin," Todd announced, his voice echoing through my kitchen speakers. "I know we are all still processing the sudden loss of Wallace. He was a visionary. But Vanguard Logistics cannot pause for grief. The market is watching us, and we must project absolute stability. Chantel has asked me to step in and guide the transitional strategy so she can focus on family matters." Calvin leaned forward, his hands folded on the polished wood table. "We appreciate you being here," Todd Calvin said, his tone respectful but guarded. "However, any transitional strategy needs to be reviewed by the legal team and the board. We need to honor the succession protocols Wallace put in place." Todd offered a condescending smile. "We are honoring his legacy, Calvin. But the logistics industry is shifting. We are currently bogged down by massive physical liabilities. Maintaining a massive fleet of trucks owning dozens of regional distribution warehouses, it is an outdated model. It ties up too much capital." I paused my typing, staring at the screen in pure disbelief. My father let out a sharp breath. Vanguard was built on owning its fleet. It was the entire reason the company could guarantee delivery times and undercut competitors. Owning the assets was the foundation of my father's wealth. "What exactly are you proposing?" Todd Calvin asked, his voice hardening. "A strategic liquidation," Todd replied smoothly. "We transition Vanguard into an asset-light tech forward brokerage. We sell off the physical trucks, the maintenance yards, and the regional warehouses. I have already been in contact with a private equity firm called Silverbridge Holdings. They specialize in acquiring distressed physical assets. They are willing to offer a massive cash injection to purchase the entire Vanguard fleet by the end of the week." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Several executives started speaking at once, protesting the sudden dismantling of the company. Calvin raised his hand, silencing the room. "You want to sell the fleet?" Calvin stated, his eyes locked onto Todd. "You want to gut the operational heart of a black-owned empire and sell it to a private equity firm less than 24 hours after the founder passed away?" "Absolutely not. The board will never approve this." Chantel finally spoke up. She let a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. "Calvin, please," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. My father trusted Todd. He knew the company needed to evolve. He left everything in our hands because he knew we would make the hard choices. We need this cash injection to secure the company's future. While Chantel weaponized her fake grief to manipulate the board, my fingers were flying across my keyboard. I did not care about Todd's corporate buzzwords. I cared about the money trail. I opened a secure terminal and ran a deep background trace on Silverbridge Holdings. Private equity firms always hide behind layers of corporate shielding, usually registered in states with strict corporate secrecy laws. But forensic accounting is just digital archaeology. If you dig deep enough, you always find the bones. I tracked Silverbridge Holdings to a registered agent in Delaware. From there, I cross-referenced the associated tax identification numbers against a database of active shell corporations. It took me less than 4 minutes to pierce the corporate veil. "Dad, look at this," I said, dragging the decryption results onto the shared monitor. My father leaned in his eyes, scanning the data. Silverbridge Holdings was not a legitimate private equity firm. It was a newly formed shell company, created less than 2 months ago. And sitting right there, listed as the primary silent partner and majority shareholder, was Todd. "He is selling the company to himself," my father said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Exactly," I confirmed, highlighting the financial flowchart I had just generated. "He is using Chantel to force the board to approve a fire sale. He will buy your fleet and your warehouses for pennies on the dollar using a leveraged buyout loan. Once Silverbridge takes ownership of the physical assets, Todd will immediately liquidate them on the open market for their actual value. He will pocket tens of millions of dollars in pure profit, completely bypassing the estate and the probate courts. He is stripping Vanguard down to the copper wiring and leaving your employees with an empty shell." We watched the screen as Calvin continued to fight back in the boardroom. "We cannot authorize a liquidation of this magnitude without reviewing the legal authority of the estate," Calvin argued. "We need to see the will. We need Malik, the estate attorney, to verify these directives." Todd smoothly pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward Calvin. "As the sole executor of the estate, I have the legal authority to bypass standard board approval in emergency financial situations," Todd declared. "The will explicitly grants me the power to restructure assets to preserve capital. We are moving forward with drafting the letter of intent for Silverbridge Holdings today." Calvin opened the folder, staring down at the forged will. He looked defeated, cornered by a piece of paper he had no reason to suspect was a complete fabrication. Chantel reached over and patted Calvin's hand, offering him a sympathetic, venomous smile. My father stepped back from the kitchen island. He looked at the live feed, watching his oldest daughter actively facilitate the destruction of his life's work. For a moment, the room was completely silent. I saw the last remaining shred of paternal leniency die in his eyes. When he finally looked back at me, the warmth was entirely gone. He was operating with absolute surgical precision. "Let them draft the letter of intent," my father commanded. "Let him put the terms on paper. Let him officially present a fraudulent contract to a corporate board of directors." I nodded, my hands already moving to set up a digital net around the Vanguard email servers. "I am intercepting all communications between Todd and the legal team," I said. "The moment he sends that letter of intent, I will capture the wire routing instructions. I will have the exact financial structure of his shell company on a silver platter." Todd thought he was executing a flawless corporate raid. He thought he had outsmarted a room full of seasoned executives by leveraging my sister's grief. He did not realize that every word he spoke, every document he forged, and every digital footprint he left was being meticulously cataloged by a forensic accountant who was building a federal case against him. We were going to let Todd dismantle the company on paper, because the heavier the fraudulent contracts became, the deeper he would sink when we finally pulled the floor out from under him. The trap was holding steady, and the prey was walking willingly into the cage. I did not stop at building the cage for Todd's corporate raid. I needed to weld the locks shut and strip them of any plausible deniability. I opened a new terminal on my primary monitor and imported the digital signature logs from the forged will and the eviction notice. Todd thought hiding behind a fake consulting firm name would shield him, but a digital document is a loud, screaming beacon if you know how to listen to it. I ran a packet trace on the IP address embedded in the email metadata. He used to send the eviction order to the courier. The numbers populated instantly. The geographic ping did not bounce to a corporate office or a legal firm. It landed squarely on the local area network router installed at the Buckhead estate. He had forged federal documents using my father's own gigabit internet connection. But the lingering question was why? Why move with such reckless, sloppy speed? Greed is usually patient, but Todd was operating with the frantic energy of a man whose life depended on liquidating assets by Friday. I launched a deep financial diagnostic on Todd's personal identity, bypassing domestic credit bureaus and tapping into international transaction registries. The progress bar crept across my screen, assembling a mosaic of financial ruin. When the final dashboard loaded, my father let out a low whistle. Todd was not just broke, he was radioactive. The screen displayed a sprawling web of offshore sports betting accounts, unregulated cryptocurrency margin calls, and high-yield promissory notes from private lenders operating out of Nevada and Macau. He was over $700,000 in the red. These were not banks calling him for minimum payments. These were the kind of creditors who show up at your front door and demand the deed to your house. Todd needed Vanguard's physical assets liquidated because he was days away from having his legs broken. I swiveled my chair to face the secondary monitor. Todd's desperation made sense, but Chantel's complicity was a different puzzle. She was already living a life of absolute luxury funded by my father. Why would she authorize the dismantling of the Golden Goose? I accessed the Vanguard Philanthropic Division, the very same community foundation Todd had tried to raid earlier. My father established that foundation to provide full-ride scholarships for students at historically black colleges and universities, and to issue zero-interest grants to minority entrepreneurs across Atlanta. It was his proudest achievement. I initiated a historical audit, running a macro script to cross-reference the foundation's outgoing vendor payments over the last 36 months. At first glance, the ledgers looked pristine. But forensic accounting requires looking at the shadows the numbers cast. I filtered the data to flag any vendor payments that matched a specific set of red flags: newly registered, limited liability companies' invoices submitted on weekends, and sequential invoice numbers lacking corresponding purchase orders. The software chimed. A cluster of suspicious transactions materialized on the screen. Over the past 3 years, the foundation had paid out nearly $400,000 to 3 different event planning and consulting firms. I ran the tax identification numbers for those 3 firms through the Georgia Secretary of State database. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I stepped back from the keyboard, leaving the results glaring on the screen. My father leaned over the island, his eyes scanning the corporate registry documents. The registered agent for all 3 shell companies was a digital mail forwarding service, but the primary beneficiary attached to the routing numbers was Chantel. My father did not shout. He did not slam his fist on the marble counter. The absolute stillness that overtook him was far more terrifying. He had worked 80-hour weeks for decades building a legacy to elevate our community, and his golden child had spent the last 3 years siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for black college students just to fund her designer bags and European vacations. She had been stealing from him and from our people long before Todd ever entered the picture. She funneled the cash directly into her vanity accounts to maintain her image as an elite socialite. That is why she is letting Todd sell the fleet, I said quietly, the final pieces of the psychological puzzle snapping into place. She knows the foundation is running out of capital. She knows an annual external audit is coming up next quarter. If the auditors look closely at those vendor payments, she goes to prison for embezzlement. She needs Todd to liquidate Vanguard and flood her accounts with untraceable cash so she can replenish the foundation funds before anyone notices they are missing. They are not just greedy, they are covering up a massive felony. My father slowly straightened his posture. He looked at the screens, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Then he turned to look at me. The devastation that had clouded his eyes all morning was completely gone. The grief of losing his eldest daughter to her own toxic narcissism had burned away, leaving behind a profound, clear-eyed clarity. He looked at my setup, the multiple encrypted servers, the cascading lines of code, the undeniable web of evidence I had unraveled in a matter of hours. He saw the daughter who had asked for nothing, who had been pushed to the margins, silently building an arsenal capable of defending his entire life's work. "You are a force of nature, Kiara," he said, his voice thick with a fierce, absolute pride. "I spent my whole life trying to protect this family, trying to build a shield made of money. I was completely blind to the fact that you were the only one who actually inherited my spine." I met his gaze, feeling a surge of strength anchor me to the floor. "We are going to let them plan their victory lap," I told him. "Chantel and Todd want to put on a show. They are going to leverage your legacy to elevate their social status, and they are going to use the church to do it. They will call a public memorial service to cement their control in front of the board and the community." My father smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that promised absolute ruin. "Then we will give them a congregation," he replied smoothly. "We will let them gather every executive, every relative, and every elite socialite in Atlanta. We will let them stand on the altar and claim the crown, and then we will walk through the front doors and show them exactly who owns the kingdom." I locked the encrypted drives and initiated the backup protocols, sealing the digital vault. The investigation was over. The trap was fully loaded. Now it was time to prepare for the execution. The very next morning, the digital invitations hit the Vanguard Logistics corporate server. I had established a routing filter to capture every outgoing communication from Todd and Chantel, sending a blind copy directly to my encrypted inbox. I opened the email, projecting it onto the large monitor in my kitchen so my father could see it. It was not a funeral announcement. It was a digital flyer for a gala. The bold gold foil lettering across the top read, "A celebration of a Titan." Below that was a highly edited, glowing photograph of my father, followed by an itinerary that looked more like a corporate summit than a memorial service. They were not wasting a single second. The service was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Greater Zion Fellowship, one of the most prominent affluent megachurches in Atlanta. It was the kind of church with stadium seating, professional broadcast cameras, and a congregation filled with local politicians, athletes, and real estate moguls. Chantel had spent her entire adult life trying to climb to the very top of that specific social ladder, and my father's supposed death was the ultimate elevator. I pulled up the corporate credit card logs. The spending was astronomical and entirely unchecked. Chantel was bleeding Vanguard's emergency administrative accounts dry to fund the spectacle. I watched the transactions populate in real time. $20,000 to a luxury floral boutique in Buckhead for imported white lilies. $15,000 to an elite event production company to handle lighting and audio-visual tributes. $10,000 to secure a private, velvet-roped VIP section in the church sanctuary specifically designated for the Vanguard Logistics Executive Board and potential investors. "She is not burying a father," I said, my eyes scanning the staggering line items. "She is throwing an inaugural ball. She wants to be crowned in front of the entire city." My father stood beside me, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. His face was a mask of pure, absolute stone. He looked at the $50,000 catering deposit that had just cleared for a post-memorial reception at an exclusive country club. "They are using my company's operating capital to buy an audience," he stated quietly. "Todd needs the executives in that room to see him standing at the pulpit. He needs the board of directors to view him as the natural successor before anyone has the chance to ask for a death certificate or a legal audit." It was a brilliantly transparent power grab. In the affluent circles of Atlanta, optics are everything. If Todd and Chantel could project absolute control, wealth, and stability at a highly publicized megachurch service, the Vanguard executives would be far less likely to challenge their authority. Calvin and the rest of the board would be pressured by the sheer social weight of the event to fall in line and accept Todd as the transitional leader. I opened another window and began intercepting Todd's direct communications. He was not grieving, he was networking. He was sending out calendar invites to city council members and regional supply chain directors. His emails were masterpieces of corporate manipulation. He framed the memorial as a celebration of my father's legacy, but neatly positioned himself as the bridge to Vanguard's future. I explicitly requested that the private equity managers from Silverbridge Holdings be given front row seating. He was bringing the very people he planned to sell the company to right into the sanctuary, parading them in front of the executives he was preparing to betray. Todd is setting the stage for the liquidation, I explained, highlighting the guest list. He wants Silverbridge in the front row so he can formally introduce them to Calvin and the board at the country club reception immediately after the service. He is going to use the emotion of the memorial to fast-track the buyout. My father leaned his hands on the marble island, his gaze locked on the digital invitation. Let him invite them, he commanded. Let him bring the private equity vultures straight to the altar. The more powerful the audience he gathers, the harder he is going to fall when the floor drops out. The sheer narcissism required to orchestrate this level of pageantry was staggering. Chantel was not just securing her financial future, she was solidifying her social dominance. I intercepted a series of emails between her and a high-end public relations firm. She had actually hired a crisis management publicist to handle the media presence at the church. The PR firm was instructed to ensure that local business magazines and news outlets had reserved seating in the balcony. She wanted her tearful, tragic performance captured in high definition and broadcast across the city. She even went as far as hiring a professional stylist. A charge for $5,000 hit the credit card for a custom-tailored morning dress. Chantel was treating grief as an aesthetic. While they were busy picking out floral arrangements and curating a guest list of Atlanta's elite, I was quietly dismantling their infrastructure. I did not disrupt a single transaction. Every time Chantel swiped the Vanguard corporate card for another ice sculpture or a gospel choir deposit, I meticulously categorized it in my forensic ledger as unauthorized misappropriation of corporate funds. I was building an itemized list of federal theft. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email directly from Chantel. I opened it on my secondary screen. The subject line simply read Friday. The email was short, cold, and entirely devoid of any sibling affection. Kiara, the message read, "We will be honoring Dad this Friday at Greater Zion. Given your erratic behavior and the severe financial discrepancies Dad uncovered regarding your accounting firm before his passing, Todd and I believe it is best if you do not attend. This event is for family and trusted business partners who actually respected his legacy. Security has been provided with your photograph and will deny you entry. Do not cause a scene." I stared at the screen, a slow, sharp smile spreading across my face. "She is banning me from the funeral," I told my father, reading the email aloud. "She is using the fake financial crimes narrative to justify locking me out of the church. She hired private security to keep me away from the microphone." My father let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "She thinks a couple of rented security guards at the front door of a church are going to stop me from walking into my own memorial service. She thinks she can ban my actual blood from the sanctuary, while she hands my company over to a white con artist." "She is terrified, Dad," I said, leaning back in my chair. "She knows that if I get anywhere near that board of directors, I will demand a financial audit. She is trying to isolate the executives so Todd can control the entire narrative without any pushback." I did not reply to her email. I did not argue or beg for an invitation. Silence is the most terrifying response you can give to a narcissist who thrives on conflict. By not responding, I was denying her the drama she craved, leaving her to wonder exactly what I was planning. "We have 48 hours until the service," my father stated, his posture straightening with absolute resolve. "We let them spend the money. We let them build their cathedral of lies. I want every single invoice tracked. When we walk through those doors, I want the exact dollar amount they stole from my company to fund this circus projected onto the screens." "Consider it done," I replied, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to run a macro script on the corporate ledger. The preparations for the memorial continued at a frantic, greedy pace. Todd and Chantel were so blinded by their impending wealth and social coronation that they failed to realize they were financing their own public execution. They were inviting the very people who would witness their total, absolute ruin. The stage was being set, the audience was gathering, and the architects of this corporate takeover were completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were preparing to bury was sitting in my kitchen actively signing their warrants. The digital trail of theft was one thing, but the social assassination, Chantel was orchestrating required a completely different level of malice. By Thursday morning, less than 24 hours before the grand memorial service, my sister deployed her smear campaign across the most respected institutions in our community. She knew that in Atlanta, your reputation is your currency. If she could bankrupt my social standing before I had a chance to speak, no one would believe a word I said about the forged will or the corporate raid. My phone rang at 9 in the morning. The caller identification displayed the name Dr. Eris Thorne, the president of the alumni board for my father's alma mater, a prestigious historically black university that received massive annual endowments from Vanguard Logistics. I answered the call, putting it on speaker so my father could hear. Kiara, Dr. Thorne began, his voice heavy with a deeply uncomfortable hesitation. I am calling to offer my profound condolences regarding Wallace. He was a pillar for this university. But I am also calling because Chantel reached out to the board of directors late last night, and we are entirely at a loss for how to process the information she shared. I leaned against the marble island, making eye contact with my father. What exactly did my sister tell the board, Dr. Thorne? There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. She informed us that your father's fatal cardiac event was triggered by severe emotional distress. She claimed that he recently discovered you had been systematically embezzling from his community foundation to fund your independent accounting firm. She said Wallace formally disinherited you hours before he passed and requested that the university sever all ties with your agency going forward to protect his legacy. The sheer, unadulterated projection was breathtaking. Chantel had spent 3 years siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from that exact foundation to buy designer clothes and fund European vacations. Now she was weaponizing her own felonies, pinning her exact crimes squarely on my shoulders to discredit me to the very community leaders my father respected most. She was using his supposed death to frame the scapegoat. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any defensive emotion. Dr. Thorne, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I assure you that my firm's financial records are immaculate and entirely transparent. I strongly advise the board to wait until after the memorial service on Friday to make any structural decisions regarding Vanguard Logistics or the endowment. After I disconnected the call, my father stood up from his bar stool. The quiet devastation he had carried the day before was gone, replaced by a cold, radiating fury. She is using the foundation I built for black scholars to drag your name through the mud, he stated, his voice a dangerous rumble. She is wearing her own guilt like a mask and trying to strap it to your face. She needs a villain, Dad, I explained, pulling up a fresh spreadsheet to document the defamation. If she paints me as the greedy, estranged daughter who broke your heart and stole your money, no one in our social circle will question why I am locked out of the estate. It is the perfect cover story for why Todd is suddenly running the company. But Chantel did not stop at the university. 10 minutes later, a text message chimed on my phone from Deacon Reynolds, a senior leader at Greater Zion Fellowship. The message was a masterclass in passive-aggressive Southern church politics. Kiara, keeping you lifted in prayer during your time of spiritual waywardness. Your sister came to the pastoral office in tears this morning. We are actively praying that the Lord softens your heart and leads you to repent for the financial betrayals that broke your father's spirit in his final hours. You are in our thoughts. My father read the message over my shoulder and let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She went to the church, he said, shaking his head in absolute disgust. She sat in the pastor's office, cried fake tears, and asked the deacons to pray for your soul because you supposedly gave me a fatal heart attack by stealing from me. She is using the pulpit to launch a public relations war. It is brilliant manipulation, I admitted, typing the deacon's message into my evidence log. In our community, if the church elders and the HBCU alumni board believe you are toxic, the rest of the city will fall in line without ever asking for proof. She is isolating me so completely that if I try to speak out, I will just look like a bitter, guilty woman lashing out at her grieving sister. While Chantel was securing the social perimeter, Todd was launching his own media offensive. A news alert flashed across my secondary monitor. It was a push notification from Atlanta Commerce Weekly, the premier digital business magazine in the region. The headline read, "A Legacy Preserved Vanguard. Logistics Transitions Leadership Following Tragic Loss." I clicked the link. It was not just an article. It was a live-streamed video interview. Todd had invited a prominent business journalist directly into the Vanguard corporate headquarters. I expanded the video to full screen. Todd was sitting in my father's massive leather chair behind my father's custom oak desk. He was wearing a dark tailored suit, looking somber professional, and completely in control. The visual alone was a glaring display of a white savior complex in motion. He was a man with a string of failed startups, sitting at the helm of a multi-million-dollar black-owned empire, acting as if he was born to rule it. The journalist, a respected local reporter, leaned forward with a sympathetic expression. Todd, the city is reeling from the loss of Wallace. How is a trailblazer? How is the family managing this sudden transition, and what does this mean for the future of Vanguard Logistics? Todd looked down at the desk for a brief moment, performing a flawless imitation of a man overwhelmed by the heavy burden of leadership. It has been the hardest 48 hours of our lives, Todd said, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. Wallace was more than a father-in-law to me. He was my mentor, my guiding light. I was with him at the hospital when he took his last breath. He looked at me, held my hand, and begged me to protect this company. I paused the video. My father crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes locked on the screen. He left me in a hallway while checking his stock portfolio on his phone, my father said flatly. I hit play again. The journalist nodded, clearly captivated by the dramatic narrative. Todd continued seamlessly. Wallace knew that Vanguard needed to evolve. Todd explained, pivoting smoothly from grief into corporate strategy. He was deeply concerned about internal greed, threatening the foundation of what he built. That is why he specifically structured his final directives to place me at the helm. He knew I had the objective clarity to make the hard choices required to preserve his legacy. Todd leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. That is why, effective immediately, Vanguard Logistics is entering into a strategic partnership with Silverbridge Holdings. We are restructuring our physical assets to modernize the company exactly as Wallace and I planned during our final conversations. We will be officially introducing the Silverbridge partners at the memorial reception this Friday. It is a new dawn for Vanguard. I stopped the video and closed the browser. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was almost suffocating. Todd had just gone on a highly publicized business broadcast and claimed that my father's dying wish was to sell the company's core assets to a private equity firm that Todd secretly owned. He was laundering his own corporate raid through the fictitious dying breath of a black patriarch. He just publicly confessed to federal fraud on a live broadcast, I stated, pulling up the screen, capturing software to save the high-resolution video file directly to my secure server. He lied to manipulate the valuation of a company while actively engaging in a self-dealing acquisition. That is a direct violation of corporate fiduciary duty and a textbook case of wire fraud. My father did not sit back down. He stood tall, his presence filling the kitchen. The man who had spent the last day quietly observing my forensic work was entirely gone, replaced by a titan ready to reclaim his territory. They have painted their masterpiece, Kiara, my father commanded. They have the alumni board, they have the church, and they have the business press. They think they have constructed a narrative so massive that it cannot be torn down. I want you to take every single piece of evidence you have pulled over the last 2 days. The forged will, the expired notary stamped the embezzlement trails, the offshore gambling debts, and this fraudulent interview. I want it all compiled, formatted, and ready for projection. I looked at him, feeling the absolute certainty of what we were about to do. I will format the data files to synchronize directly with the church's audio-visual system, I assured him. When we step into that sanctuary, I am not just going to dispute their story. I am going to put their financial crimes on a 50-foot high-definition screen for the entire city to see. Todd and Chantel thought they had successfully sabotaged my name and secured the empire. They were currently picking out their mourning outfits and practicing their eulogies, completely unaware that their meticulously planned coronation was actually a highly coordinated public execution. The snare was pulled taut, the audience was seated, and the dead man was preparing to walk straight through the front doors of his own funeral. I initiated a secure encrypted video conference line directly to Malik's private office. Malik was not just my father's estate attorney. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who had spent the last 2 decades protecting the Vanguard Empire from every conceivable legal threat. He was fiercely loyal to my father and completely intolerant of incompetence. I had briefed him on the situation 12 hours ago, providing him with the forged will, the expired notary data, and the printer steganography report. Malik's face appeared on my primary monitor. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking incredibly calm for a man who was about to facilitate a federal sting operation. Kiara Malik greeted his voice a smooth, low baritone. I received the digital invitation for the memorial service. Chantel certainly knows how to spend other people's money. She is using Vanguard's emergency funds, I confirmed, pulling up the transaction ledger on the shared screen. She has blown through over $80,000 in the last 48 hours. Malik let out a dry, humorless chuckle. A drop in the bucket compared to what Todd is trying to steal. But we are about to put a hard stop to all of it. Todd requested an emergency meeting with me this afternoon. He claims he needs to expedite the execution of Wallace's will to stabilize the company ahead of the memorial service. My father leaned into the camera frame. Let him expedite his own prison sentence, Malik. Give him exactly what he wants. Wallace Malik said, a genuine smile breaking through his professional demeanor. It is good to see you looking so lethal. Do not worry. I have laid out the red carpet for our young visionary. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. If Todd presented a forged will, he was committing a crime. But if Malik forced him to legally attest to its validity under oath, signing supplementary sworn affidavits, Todd would be committing multiple counts of premeditated perjury and federal fraud. We needed Todd to put his signature on documents that explicitly confirmed he witnessed the signing of the will and affirmed my father's death. I routed a live audio feed from Malik's office conference room directly to my secure server. Malik had positioned a discreet microphone in the center of the table. We were not going to miss a single second of Todd's performance. At exactly 2 o'clock, the audio feed crackled to life. I heard the heavy oak doors of Malik's conference room swing open. Todd's voice boomed through the speakers, loud and entirely too confident. Malik, thank you for making the time, Todd said, pulling out a leather chair. I know this is highly irregular, but Vanguard needs leadership immediately. The market is volatile and we cannot afford a power vacuum. I understand completely. Todd Malik replied, his tone laced with a practiced, deferential smoothness that I knew meant he was actively setting a trap. Wallace's passing is a devastating blow. I was surprised not to hear from him directly regarding these changes to his estate, but in times of crisis, we must rely on the documents presented. Todd cleared his throat, likely adjusting his suit jacket. Wallace was very private about his final wishes. Todd lied effortlessly. He wanted to ensure Chantel and I were positioned to protect the legacy without the interference of certain family members who have proven to be financially irresponsible. He is talking about you, Kiara, my father noted, his voice a low growl. Let him talk, I replied, my fingers hovering over the recording software. Every lie is another nail in the coffin. I have reviewed the document you sent over, Todd Malik continued. It is a significant departure from Wallace's previous estate planning. As the named executor, you understand that this grants you absolute authority over Vanguard Logistics, the philanthropic foundation, and all private holdings. That is correct, Todd affirmed. Wallace knew I had the business acumen to handle the transition. We need to formalize this immediately. I have a letter of intent drafted for a strategic partnership with Silverbridge Holdings, and the Vanguard Board requires verification of my executive authority before they will sign off. Silverbridge Holdings, Malik repeated, feigning mild curiosity. A private equity firm. That is a bold move for Vanguard. It is necessary, Todd insisted. The company is hemorrhaging capital maintaining its physical fleet. We need to liquidate those assets to modernize the infrastructure. I paused my typing, looking at my father. Todd was actually trying to sell the company's core assets while sitting in the office of the man who built the legal framework for that very fleet. The arrogance was staggering. Well, Todd, to grant you that level of immediate authority, we have to bypass standard probate protocols, Malik explained, the trap slowly springing shut. Given the sudden nature of Wallace's passing and the lack of an official death certificate, at this exact moment, I need you to execute a series of sworn affidavits. These documents will serve as legal verification of the events and the authenticity of the will. I have no problem signing whatever is necessary, Todd replied eagerly. Excellent, Malik said. You can hear the sound of heavy paper being slid across the conference table. The first document is an affidavit of death. By signing this, you are swearing under penalty of perjury that you were present at the time of Wallace's passing and can legally attest to his death. I will sign it right now, Todd said. The scratch of a pen echoed through the audio feed. Perfect. The second document is an affidavit of execution. Malik continued smoothly. This legally affirms that you personally witnessed Wallace sign this specific last will and testament, and that he was of sound mind and acting without duress. Todd did not even hesitate. The pen scratched against the paper again. And finally, Malik said, his voice dropping to a serious, finalizing tone, an affidavit of executor fiduciary duty. This states that you are acting entirely in the best interest of the estate, and that you hold no undisclosed conflicts of interest or secret financial partnerships regarding any proposed corporate transactions, including your dealings with Silverbridge Holdings. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Todd was staring directly at a document that legally required him to disclose his ownership of the shell company he was planning to use for the corporate raid. If he signed it, he was committing federal fraud. If he didn't, he couldn't take control of the estate. Where do I sign? Todd asked, his greed completely overpowering his survival instinct. Right at the bottom, Todd. And I will notarize these immediately. The final signature echoed through the speakers. I stopped the recording and immediately initiated a secure upload to my encrypted cloud server. Todd had just handed us the kill switch. He had legally sworn to a death that never happened, authenticated a forged document, and committed perjury regarding a multi-million-dollar corporate raid. Malik's voice returned to the private video conference line a few minutes later, after Todd had left the building. The attorney looked incredibly satisfied. We have it all in writing, Kiara Malik confirmed, holding up the freshly signed affidavits. He perjured himself 3 times in under 10 minutes. He is entirely locked in. And the Vanguard board, my father asked, leaning toward the screen. Todd is heading to the corporate headquarters right now, Malik replied. He is going to present these notarized documents to Calvin and demand they sign the letter of intent with Silverbridge Holdings. Let them sign it, I instructed, pulling up the formatting software for the church's audio-visual system. We want the board completely cornered. We want Todd standing on that pulpit on Friday holding a signed contract, thinking he has successfully stolen an empire. Malik nodded in agreement. I will see you both at Greater Zion Fellowship. It is going to be a highly educational service. I disconnected the call and turned to the massive digital files I had compiled over the last 3 days. The trap was fully constructed, the evidence was ironclad, and the antagonist had willingly signed his own confession. Now it was time to prepare the presentation. Todd and Chantel wanted a memorial service to celebrate their newfound power. We were going to give them a public execution they would never forget. Friday arrived with the kind of oppressive, suffocating heat that usually keeps people indoors, but Greater Zion Fellowship was overflowing to maximum capacity. I sat in the back of a blacked-out luxury sport utility vehicle parked directly across the street from the megachurch, balancing my encrypted tablet on my knees. My father sat right beside me. He was dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, looking completely serene and terrifyingly sharp. We were sitting in the air-conditioned quiet, watching the live high-definition broadcast of his own funeral. Chantel had spared absolutely no expense for her grand coronation. The massive church parking lot was a sprawling sea of luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were rushing frantically back and forth, guiding in an endless parade of Maybachs, Range Rovers, and Bentleys. Local news vans were parked strategically near the secondary entrances, their satellite dishes raised high to catch the live feed. The sheer scale of the production was staggering. She had turned a solemn memorial into the social event of the season. I ran a complex decryption sequence on my tablet, seamlessly bypassing the church's primary firewall. Greater Zion Fellowship boasted a state-of-the-art multimedia system, the exact kind used for global television broadcasting. They operated on a closed commercial network, but to a forensic accountant with a background in system audits. A network is just a series of locked doors waiting for the right key. I had spent Thursday night digitally mapping the architecture of their entire audio-visual system. I spoofed the media access control address of their master control board. Within 4 minutes of sitting in the vehicle, I possessed full administrative control over every massive screen, every projector, and every audio channel inside that sanctuary. The media production team sitting in the elevated sound booth thought they were running the show, completely unaware that the disinherited sister sitting in a vehicle across the street was currently holding the master switch. I pulled up the internal security camera feeds on my tablet, giving my father and me a perfect unobstructed view of the congregation. The sanctuary was packed to absolute capacity. Over 2,000 people had gathered to pay their respects to the titan of Atlanta logistics. I scanned the first few rows of the premium seating. Dr. Thorne from the alumni board was there looking appropriately grave. Calvin and the entire executive suite from Vanguard Logistics occupied a reserved VIP section on the right side of the main aisle. Sitting directly behind them exactly as Todd had orchestrated were the executives from Silverbridge Holdings. They were sitting in a black church waiting to eagerly claim their stolen prize. The camera panned to the very front row. Chantel sat dead center, bathed in the soft, dramatic lighting her hired production team had arranged. She wore a custom black couture dress with a subtle, tasteful lace veil that framed her face perfectly for the broadcast cameras. She was gently dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, performing an Oscar-worthy display of shattered, inconsolable grief. Every time a prominent local politician or a wealthy socialite approached her pew to offer their deep condolences, her shoulders would heave with perfectly timed, delicate sobs. She was not mourning a father. She was holding court. She had successfully positioned herself as the tragic, resilient heiress of a massive corporate empire, soaking in the public sympathy and the perceived absolute power that came with it. The massive digital screens flanking the altar displayed a high-definition black-and-white portrait of my father. Soft, mournful piano music filled the massive sanctuary. The senior pastor stepped up to the polished glass podium, offered a brief, booming prayer about enduring legacy and difficult transitions, and then introduced the man who would be guiding the grieving family through this dark valley. Todd walked up the marble steps to the pulpit. He adjusted his microphone with practiced theatrical solemnity. He was wearing a stark black suit, his posture radiating an unearned, sickening confidence. He looked out over the sea of black excellence, the seasoned executives, the community leaders, the politicians, and he genuinely believed he owned every single one of them. "Thank you all for being here today." Todd began, his voice echoing through the massive sanctuary and projecting directly into the speakers of my tablet. "We are gathered to honor a giant among men. Wallace was a pioneer who built a kingdom with his bare hands, but to me he was a deeply personal mentor, a guiding force. He brought me into this beautiful family and trusted me with his ultimate vision." My father let out a quiet, dangerous breath next to me. "The last few days have been the most difficult and painful of our lives." Todd continued, expertly pausing for dramatic effect. "Chantel is completely heartbroken. The burden of this sudden loss is staggering for her. But Wallace did not build Vanguard Logistics to watch it falter in a moment of crisis. During our final private conversations, he made his ultimate directives very clear. He knew the market was rapidly changing. He knew the company required a strong, steady hand to navigate the turbulent future. He asked me to step in to carry that heavy burden for my wife and to guide this family out of the darkness. I watched Calvin shift uncomfortably in his VIP seat on the monitor. Todd was actively using the church pulpit to enforce his fraudulent corporate mandate. I was utilizing his white savior complex to box a board of highly qualified black directors into a corner in front of 2,000 influential witnesses. He was daring them to challenge his authority at a funeral. That is why I am profoundly humbled to announce that we are honoring his dying wish today. Todd projected, his voice rising with theatrical, practiced authority. Today we are not just saying goodbye to the past. We are embracing a new dawn. Vanguard Logistics is officially entering into a strategic partnership with Silverbridge Holdings to modernize our entire infrastructure. We are securing the legacy. We are ensuring that Wallace's incredible vision lives on for generations to come. The audacity was completely suffocating. He was finalizing a fraudulent corporate raid at a memorial service, wrapping his massive embezzlement scheme in the language of honor and family duty. He looked down at Chantel, who offered him a trembling, supportive smile perfectly angled for the news cameras. They genuinely thought they had executed the perfect crime. They had the forged will, the newly signed perjury affidavits, the board's reluctant public submission, and the city's absolute sympathy. I looked away from the tablet screen and turned to my father. He was staring straight ahead at the massive stained glass windows of the church across the street. The quiet anger he had carried for the last 3 days had settled into something permanent and completely immovable. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, his movements precise and incredibly calm. "Are you locked into their broadcasting system?" Kiara, my father asked, his voice steady and cold. I tapped the final execution command on my screen. The data packets containing the expired notary stamps, the printer identification codes, the offshore gambling debts, and the charity embezzlement logs were fully loaded into the church's active broadcasting queue. The pristine audio feed from Malik's office featuring Todd gleefully committing federal perjury on tape was queued up to completely override the main soundboard. I have full administrative control. I confirmed, closing the tablet and placing it securely in my leather bag. The second we walk through those main doors, I trigger the total override. They will not be able to shut the massive screens off. They will not be able to cut the microphones, and they will not be able to stop the video playback. My father gave a single definitive nod. He reached for the chrome door handle of the sport utility vehicle. "Todd is up there talking about a beautiful new dawn," my father said, pushing the heavy door open and stepping out into the blinding Georgia heat. "Let us go show him what the light actually looks like." I stepped out right behind him, smoothing the crisp lines of my tailored black blazer. We walked across the hot asphalt, our footsteps perfectly synchronized, heading straight for the towering double doors of the main sanctuary. The private security guards Chantel had hired were standing on the front steps, holding laminated clipboards with my photograph on them, fully prepared to forcefully turn away the disgraced, disinherited daughter. They had absolutely no idea that the very ghost they were supposed to be mourning was walking right up the concrete steps to forcefully claim his house. The 2 private security guards standing at the top of the concrete steps were exactly what you would expect Chantel to hire for a high-profile social event. They were massive, wearing tight black suits and earpieces, trying to look as intimidating as possible. One of them held a laminated clipboard. As I stepped onto the top landing, he immediately stepped directly into my path, raising a thick, calloused hand to physically block the heavy oak doors. "Ma'am, you are not permitted on these premises." The guard stated, his voice a low, practiced rumble. "The family has explicitly requested that you be denied entry. Please turn around and walk back to the street before we have to escort you." He never even finished his sentence. His eyes shifted from my face to the man standing right beside me. The guard looked at my father. Then he looked at the massive gold foil memorial banner positioned next to the entrance, which featured a high-resolution portrait of my father. Then he looked back at the living, breathing man standing 3 feet away from him. The color completely vanished from the security guard's face. His jaw went slack and his hand dropped to his side as if the muscles had simply given out. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, nearly tripping over the feet of his partner, who was now staring at my father with the exact same expression of absolute paralyzing terror. They were hired to keep a disinherited sister out of a funeral. Nobody paid them enough to stop a ghost from attending his own memorial. My father did not say a single word to them. He did not even break his stride. He simply walked past the frozen guards, reached out and grasped the brass handle of the right oak door. I grabbed the left. We pushed the heavy doors open together. We stepped into the sprawling, dimly lit vestibule of Greater Zion Fellowship. The muffled sound of Todd's voice bled through the inner sanctuary doors. A group of ushers wearing pristine white gloves were standing near the entrance, whispering among themselves while holding stacks of glossy memorial programs. One of the ushers turned around to greet us. The young man gasped so sharply he choked on his own breath. The stack of programs slipped from his white-gloved hands, scattering across the polished tile floor. The programs featured my father's birth date and a fabricated date of death, printed in elegant gold typography. My father looked down at the programs, then looked up at the closed sanctuary doors. "Are you ready?" my father asked me, his voice a quiet, resonant anchor in the heavy silence of the vestibule. I reached into my pocket and gripped my phone, my thumb resting directly over the execution command for the church's audio-visual system. "I have been ready my entire life," I replied. We pushed the inner doors wide open. The heavy wood swung outward with a deep, echoing thud that cut perfectly through the acoustics of the 2,000-seat sanctuary. At the pulpit, Todd was leaning into the microphone, his face projected onto the 50-foot digital screens flanking the altar. "Wallace would want us to move forward without hesitation," Todd was saying, projecting his voice with that sickening, unearned confidence. "He would want us to embrace this new partnership, to trust the process, and to find peace in knowing the Vanguard legacy is in capable hands." I stepped out of the shadows of the vestibule and directly into the center aisle. The church was incredibly bright, the theatrical lighting illuminating every single row. The whispers started instantly in the back pews. It began as a low, confused murmur. People recognized me. They had been told I was banned, that I was a criminal who had broken my father's heart. Heads began to turn. Then my father stepped out of the shadows and walked into the bright sanctuary light right beside me. The reaction was not a gasp. It was a physical shockwave. A visceral collective tremor of absolute disbelief swept from the back of the megachurch all the way to the front. It moved like a current through the pews. People in the back rows shot to their feet. A woman a few rows ahead of us let out a muffled shriek and clutched her chest. Men who had known my father for 30 years took off their glasses, rubbing their eyes as if their vision had suddenly failed them. The murmurs escalated into a chaotic rising tide of sheer panic and confusion. We began our walk down the long, red-carpeted aisle. We did not rush. We walked with the slow, deliberate, terrifying march of a king returning to reclaim a stolen throne. I kept my head high, my posture perfectly rigid, my eyes locked on the altar. My father walked with immense, undeniable authority. Every step he took dismantled the lie Chantel had built. Up on the pulpit, the rising noise from the congregation finally broke Todd's concentration. He paused his fraudulent eulogy and looked up, highly annoyed by the interruption to his grand performance. His eyes scanned the center aisle. Todd froze entirely. The microphone picked up his sudden, sharp intake of breath, broadcasting his panic through the massive sanctuary speakers. The smug white savior confidence completely evaporated from his features in a fraction of a second. His hands gripped the edges of the glass podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. I was staring directly at the dead man he had just legally sworn under penalty of perjury was deceased. In the front row, Chantel turned around. She was frustrated that her perfect, tragic spectacle was being disrupted by the commotion in the pews. She peered through her tasteful black lace mourning veil. She saw me first. Her eyes narrowed with pure, unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth, likely preparing to signal the ushers to have me forcefully removed. Then her gaze shifted 6 inches to the right. The designer lace handkerchief slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the carpet. Her mouth parted in a silent, horrified scream. The color literally drained from her face, leaving her looking ashen hollow and profoundly sick. Her knees gave out. She grabbed the polished wooden back of the pew in front of her to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The golden child, the master manipulator, the woman who thought she could steal an empire by shedding fake tears, was suddenly hyperventilating in her custom couture dress. She was looking right at the father she had abandoned in an emergency room. We kept walking. We passed the row where Aunt Beatrice and my cousin Jamal were sitting. Jamal's mouth was hanging wide open, his phone slipping out of his hand and clattering against the wooden pew. Aunt Beatrice pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. They had spent the last 3 days trashing my name defending Todd and aligning themselves with the new regime. Now the old regime was walking right past them, alive, healthy, and looking at them with absolute permanent disgust. We reached the reserved VIP section. Calvin and the senior executives from Vanguard Logistics were already on their feet. Calvin rubbed his eyes, utterly bewildered, his gaze darting rapidly between my father walking down the aisle and Todd shivering behind the pulpit. The executives from Silverbridge Holdings, the predatory private equity partners. Todd had brought into the sanctuary looked frantically around the room. They sensed the shift in power instantly. They were corporate sharks, and they knew immediately that their easy, highly lucrative buyout had just turned into a catastrophic federal nightmare. The massive gospel choir, which had been softly humming a backing track behind Todd's speech, completely stopped singing. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. The only sound left in the massive sanctuary was the heavy, synchronized clicking of our shoes against the floor. We reached the very front of the church. The silence in the 2,000-seat sanctuary was so absolute it was deafening. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I stopped at the edge of the first row, standing mere feet away from Chantel. She could not bring herself to look me in the eye. She was trembling so violently the lace veil shook against her face. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen, resting my thumb over the execution command for the media broadcast override. My father did not stop. He walked past Chantel without giving her a single glance. He stopped at the base of the marble steps leading up to the massive altar. He looked up at Todd. Todd looked like he was going to vomit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the bright stage lights. The fraudulent letter of intent for Vanguard Logistics was resting on the podium right in front of him, right next to the microphone. My father did not yell. He did not make a scene. His silence was infinitely heavier and far more violent than any shout could ever be. He placed his polished leather shoe on the first marble step and began his ascent toward the pulpit. The stage was officially ours, and the public execution was about to begin. My father reached the top of the marble steps and walked directly over to the glass podium. Todd was completely frozen. He was gripping the edges of the pulpit so tightly that his knuckles were stark white, his eyes wide and vacant, like a man staring into the headlights of an oncoming train. The fraudulent letter of intent for Vanguard Logistics rested on the glass surface right in front of him. My father did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He simply placed his large palm flat over the forged document and slowly slid it out from under Todd's trembling fingers. He leaned in close, his voice too low for the microphone to catch, but the sheer terror that washed over Todd's face told me everything I needed to know. My father placed a firm hand on Todd's shoulder and physically guided the paralyzed man away from the microphone, stepping into the center of the pulpit himself. The silence in the massive sanctuary was absolute. 2,000 people held their breath. My father tapped the microphone once. The deep, resonant thump echoed through the stadium speakers. He looked out over the sea of faces, his dark eyes scanning the executives, the politicians, the church elders, and finally his gaze settled on Chantel in the front row. I apologize for being late to my own memorial. My father said, his voice a calm, devastating rumble that filled every corner of the church. But as you can see, reports of my passing have been greatly exaggerated. A collective shuddering gasp rippled through the pews. Several people in the back rows murmured prayers of shock. Dr. Thorne, the president of the alumni board, slowly stood up from his seat, his hand pressed over his heart. Calvin and the Vanguard executives in the VIP section stared at the altar in utter bewilderment. I had a mild cardiac event on Tuesday evening. My father continued, his tone conversational, but laced with a lethal edge. I was transported to Emory Hospital. The doctors stabilized me quite rapidly. However, the two people who rode behind the ambulance, the two people who stood on this very stage and claimed they held my hand until my last breath, did not stick around to find out if I survived. They left me unconscious in a triage hallway, assumed I was dead, and sped back to my estate to begin looting my private safe and claiming my assets. The reaction from the congregation was immediate and visceral. A wave of horrified murmurs swept across the sanctuary. People turned to stare at Chantel. She shrank back against the wooden pew, her face completely drained of color. Her hands shook violently as she clutched the designer lace veil she had worn to play the grieving heiress. They thought they could bury me before my heart even stopped beating. My father stated, his voice ring with absolute authority. And since they decided to use this holy sanctuary to finalize their theft, I decided it was only fitting to use this same sanctuary to show all of you exactly who they are. Kiara, if you please. That was my cue. I stood up from the edge of the front row, holding my encrypted tablet. I tapped the execution command I had carefully queued up in the church's master audiovisual system. The 50-foot digital screens flanking the altar instantly flickered. The glowing edited portrait of my father vanished into blackness. A split second later, a high-definition spreadsheet illuminated the massive screens. It was the financial ledger for the Vanguard Philanthropic Foundation. My father did not even look at the screens. He knew exactly what was behind him. He looked directly at the congregation. Many of you in this room are community leaders, my father said, his voice echoing with profound disappointment. Many of you are alumni of the institutions I support. You know that my charity foundation was built to provide full-ride scholarships for Black youth and zero-interest grants for minority businesses in South Atlanta. He pointed a finger down at Chantel. For the last 3 years, my eldest daughter has been systematically embezzling from that foundation. She created 3 fraudulent shell companies and invoiced the charity for non-existent consulting fees. She stole nearly $400,000, meant for the education of our community, to fund her designer wardrobe and her luxury vacations. The sanctuary erupted into angry, disgusted whispers. Dr. Thorne shook his head, looking down at Chantel with absolute revulsion. The church elders who had prayed for my soul just 24 hours ago now stared at my sister as if she were a venomous snake. Chantel opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but no sound came out. She was entirely trapped by the blazing 50-foot-tall bank records displayed above her head. My father turned his attention to the right side of the aisle. Calvin, he called out, addressing the chief operating officer directly. Calvin stood up instantly, his posture rigid with respect. Yes, sir, Calvin responded, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet church. The man cowering beside me on this stage told you that my dying wish was to sell our physical fleet, my father said. He told you Vanguard needed to transition into an asset-light brokerage. He told you to sign a letter of intent with Silverbridge Holdings. I tapped my tablet screen. The foundation ledgers vanished, replaced immediately by the corporate registration documents for Silverbridge Holdings. I highlighted the majority ownership block in bright neon yellow. Todd is not a visionary, my father announced, his voice slicing through the heavy air. Todd is drowning in over $700,000 of offshore gambling debt. Silverbridge Holdings is a shell company that he registered himself 2 months ago. He planned to use my daughter's fraudulent authority to force the board into a leveraged buyout. He was going to buy my fleet with my own money, liquidate the assets to pay off his bookies, and leave every single Vanguard employee without a job. Calvin's face turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He turned and glared at the private equity partners from Silverbridge Holdings, who were sitting directly behind him. The predatory investors realized instantly that their highly lucrative corporate raid had just transformed into a catastrophic federal trap. 2 of them grabbed their briefcases and immediately tried to stand up and slip out the side aisle. "Do not let them leave," Calvin barked to the Vanguard executives sitting next to him. A wall of broad-shouldered logistics directors instantly stood up, physically blocking the pew exit and trapping the fraudulent investors in their seats. My father looked back at Todd. Todd was trembling so badly he looked like he might collapse onto the marble floor. He had nowhere to run. He was standing on a highly elevated stage in front of 2,000 hostile witnesses. But a corporate raid was not quite enough for him. My father continued delivering the final fatal blow. He wanted to ensure that my youngest daughter, the woman who actually built her own accounting firm from the ground up, was left entirely homeless. He sent a forged eviction notice to her condo, utilizing a backdated will he printed himself. I tapped the tablet one last time. The massive screens shifted to display the sworn affidavits Todd had signed in Malik's office just yesterday afternoon. Next to the affidavits, I projected the printer's steganography report, clearly showing the exact time and location the forged will was manufactured. My father read the screen aloud for the congregation. He went to my estate attorney yesterday and legally swore under penalty of perjury that he witnessed my death. He signed federal documents attesting to the authenticity of a will he printed from his own fake consulting firm mere minutes after Chantel called to tell Kiara I was gone. He committed federal wire fraud, mail fraud, and perjury, and he signed his own confession. The silence that followed was total and devastating. The entire sanctuary absorbed the sheer, staggering magnitude of the crimes committed by the two people who had called them there to mourn. My father stood at the pulpit breathing steadily, a self-made titan who had just flawlessly executed the greatest audit of his life. He looked down at Chantel, who was now weeping genuinely into her hands, completely shattered by the public destruction of her social empire. He looked at Todd, who was staring blankly at the floor, realizing his entire life was over. "You wanted a memorial," my father said, his voice dropping to a quiet, terrifying finality. "You wanted to stand on this altar and bury my legacy so you could steal my crown. Consider it done. But you are the ones being buried today." My father stepped away from the microphone. He did not look back at them. He walked calmly down the marble steps of the pulpit, descending toward the floor of the sanctuary, where I was waiting for him. The screens behind the altar remained glowing brightly, burning the irrefutable evidence of their financial crimes into the minds of every single powerful person in the city of Atlanta. The roar inside Greater Zion Fellowship was deafening. 2,000 people were talking, shouting, and pointing all at once. The grand memorial service had instantly dissolved into an absolute chaotic spectacle of biblical proportions. The massive digital screens behind the pulpit were still glowing brightly, burning Todd and Chantel's financial felonies into the collective memory of Atlanta's elite. I stood at the base of the marble steps, my posture rigid, my encrypted tablet held loosely at my side. I watched my father descend the pulpit. He did not look rushed. He moved with the slow, terrifying calm of a predator walking away from a successful kill. As soon as my father reached the floor of the sanctuary, the flying monkeys descended. Aunt Beatrice was the first to break from her pew. She practically lunged into the center aisle, her elaborate Sunday hat slightly askew, her face twisted into a frantic mask of desperate damage control. Right behind her was my cousin Jamal, shoving past a group of stunned deacons to reach the front. "Wallace, oh, praise the Lord, Wallace!" Aunt Beatrice cried out, her voice shrill and trembling. "We had no idea. We were deceived. That awful white boy manipulated Chantel and she manipulated us. You have to believe me, brother, we never would have turned our backs on Kiara if we knew the truth." Jamal skidded to a halt right next to her, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Uncle Wallace, Kiara, I swear I did not know about the forged will. Todd fed us a completely different story. You know I have always had your back, man. We are blood." My father stopped walking. The physical space between him and his sister was less than 3 feet, but the emotional chasm was infinite. He looked at Aunt Beatrice, then at Jamal. His expression did not hold a single ounce of familial warmth. It was completely void of mercy. "You did not know about the forged will," my father repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "But you knew they left me in a hospital hallway. You knew they were actively trying to strip my youngest daughter of her home. You called Kiara and demanded she bow to a thief, not because you thought Todd was a good man, but because you thought he was holding my checkbook." Aunt Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, her hands fluttering anxiously, but my father cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave. "Do not say another word to me, Beatrice," he commanded. "You sat at my table for 30 years. I paid your mortgages. I funded your son's failures. And the absolute second you thought I was in the ground, you aligned yourselves with the vultures. You are not my blood. You are parasites." He turned his piercing gaze to Jamal, who physically shrank backward. "Do not ever call my daughter again," my father stated. "Do not approach my estate. If I see either of you anywhere near Vanguard Logistics, I will have you arrested for trespassing. You are cut off, completely and permanently." Aunt Beatrice let out a wounded theatrical sob, grabbing Jamal's arm, as the reality of her total financial excommunication sank in. My father did not spare them another glance. He turned and walked directly toward me, placing a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. We stood together, an unbreakable, unified front, watching the absolute destruction unfolding on the altar. Up on the pulpit, the situation had escalated from corporate humiliation to a federal nightmare. Todd was desperately trying to gather the fraudulent legal documents he had placed on the glass podium, his hands shaking so violently that the papers kept slipping from his grasp. He looked wildly toward the side exits, clearly calculating his chances of escaping through the choir loft. He never made it past the first step. From the shadows of the vestibule, Malik emerged. My father's estate attorney walked with the smooth, lethal confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. He was not alone. Flanking him were 3 plainclothes federal agents and 2 uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. Malik had coordinated the raid, perfectly timing their entrance precisely with my digital projection. Todd froze as the authorities marched directly down the center aisle, moving with immediate, unyielding purpose. Todd Malik called out, his voice echoing clearly through the massive sanctuary. "I believe we have some unfinished legal business regarding those sworn affidavits you executed in my office yesterday." Todd took a stumbling step backward, his back hitting the glass podium. He raised his hands, stammering frantically. "Malik, wait. We can talk about this. I was acting under the directives I was given. Chantel told me the will was valid. She authorized the corporate transition. I was throwing his own wife under the bus in front of 2,000 people desperately trying to shed the federal charges." The lead federal agent stepped up onto the marble altar. He did not hesitate. He grabbed Todd's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the church microphones. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice booming over the church speakers. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Todd's knees buckled. He was sobbing openly now, his pristine corporate facade completely shattered. The white savior who had confidently strolled onto the pulpit to claim a black empire was now being physically dragged down the altar steps in federal restraints. In the VIP section, the executives from Silverbridge Holdings had completely abandoned their seats. They were speed-walking down the side aisles, holding their briefcases tight to their chests, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the man currently being arrested for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate raid. Calvin, the chief operating officer of Vanguard, stood near the front row, watching Todd being hauled down the aisle. Calvin locked eyes with my father. My father gave him a single respectful nod, silently confirming that the company was secure and the hostile takeover was permanently neutralized. Calvin nodded back, the profound relief washing over his features. I turned my attention to the front row. Chantel was still clutching the polished wooden pew. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly styled mourning veil pushed back from her face. Her designer mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She watched her husband get dragged out of the sanctuary by federal agents, knowing that every single crime he had committed was directly tied to her own embezzlement scheme. She slowly turned her head, her terrified, bloodshot eyes locking onto my father. The golden child was entirely stripped of her power, her social standing annihilated in front of the very elite she had tried so desperately to impress. Chantel stood alone in the front row, the carefully curated illusion of her life evaporating in real time. The designer veil she had worn to play the grieving heiress was now pushed back, revealing a face distorted by sheer terror and mascara-stained tears. She watched her husband, the man who was supposed to be her partner in this grand theft, being marched down the center aisle in handcuffs by federal agents. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The social elite of Atlanta, the people she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress, were staring at her with undisguised contempt. She took a stumbling step forward, her hands outstretched in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Dad," she cried out, her voice cracking as it echoed through the massive sanctuary. "Dad, please. You have to understand. I didn't know Todd was going to do all of this. He told me it was what you would have wanted. I was grieving. I was confused." My father did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his posture rigid and unyielding. The man who had spent 32 years shielding her from every consequence, paying off every debt and cleaning up every mess was gone. "You did not know Chantel," My father repeated, his voice carrying the dangerous, quiet calm of a storm that had already destroyed everything in its path. You did not know he was trying to sell my company to a shell firm he owned. You did not know he forged a will to leave your sister homeless. No, Chantel sobbed, nodding frantically. I swear to God, Dad. I thought the will was real. I thought, but you did know about the $400,000. My father interrupted, his words slicing through her defense like a surgical blade. You knew about the shell companies you registered. You knew about the fraudulent invoices you submitted to the Community Foundation every month for the last 3 years. You knew you were stealing from black scholars to buy your designer bags. Did Todd force you to do that, Chantel? Did he make you embezzle my charity funds long before you ever planned my funeral? Chantel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The massive digital screens behind the pulpit were still glowing with the irrefutable evidence of her crimes. The bank routing numbers, the shell company registrations, the exact dates and amounts all tied directly to her name. She had no defense. The lies she had relied on her entire life were utterly useless in the face of forensic truth. She dropped to her knees right there in the front row, her designer dress pooling around her on the carpet. Please, Daddy, she begged, abandoning all pretense of dignity. Please don't do this. I'm your daughter. You can't just leave me with nothing. I am not leaving you with nothing, my father said, his voice hard and absolute. I am leaving you exactly where you put yourself. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized document. It was a formal revocation of trust and disinheritance agreement, drafted and expedited by Malik earlier that morning. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my father announced, his voice projecting clearly to ensure every executive and socialite in the room heard him. I have legally and permanently revoked your access to all Vanguard Logistics corporate accounts, all personal trusts, and all affiliated credit lines. You are removed as a beneficiary from my estate. The keys to the Buckhead properties have been deactivated, and the locks have been changed. Chantel gasped, a ragged, desperate sound. You're kicking me out of my house. It was never your house, Chantel, my father corrected coldly. It was a luxury I provided. A luxury you repaid by abandoning me in an emergency room and trying to steal my legacy. He held the document up. You are completely and entirely disinherited. You will not receive another dime from me or my companies for the rest of your life. And consider yourself fortunate that I am not having Malik hand this embezzlement file over to the federal agents who just arrested your husband. The silence in the church was absolute. No one moved. No one whispered. They were witnessing the total systematic destruction of a golden child who had finally pushed a titan too far. Chantel knelt on the floor, weeping hysterically, realizing that the endless well of forgiveness and funding had permanently run dry. Her social standing in Atlanta was not just damaged, it was obliterated. She would be a pariah, the woman who tried to rob her own father's charity and bury him alive. I watched my sister fall apart, feeling no triumph, only a profound, clarifying relief. The toxic ecosystem that had drained our family for decades was finally dismantled. The parasite had been removed. My father handed the revocation document to Calvin, the chief operating officer, who stood nearby. Make sure the board has this on file immediately, my father instructed. Calvin nodded, his expression grave but respectful. Let's go home, Kiara, my father said, turning to me. He did not look back at Chantel. He offered me his arm, and together we walked back down the center aisle of Greater Zion Fellowship, leaving the wreckage of their greed behind us. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of Greater Zion Fellowship closed behind us. The dust from that explosive Friday afternoon settled, leaving behind a completely altered landscape. When you forcefully extract a toxic infection from your life, the immediate aftermath is chaotic, but the long-term result is absolute, undeniable clarity. Todd is currently residing in a federal holding facility. The Department of Justice does not negotiate when presented with a perfectly documented, irrefutable case of wire fraud, mail fraud, and perjury. Malik had handed the federal prosecutors a bow-tied package containing every IP address, every forged signature, and every digital footprint Todd carelessly left behind. The private equity vultures at Silverbridge Holdings completely disavowed him the second the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. dissolving the shell company and cooperating with the authorities to save their own licenses. Todd has been denied bail twice, deemed a flight risk due to his massive offshore gambling debts. He is sitting in a concrete cell awaiting a federal trial where he is facing up to 20 years in prison. The arrogant savior who thought he could steal a black-owned empire is now just another federal inmate number waiting for a sentencing hearing. Chantel's reality is arguably an even harsher punishment because she actually has to live it in public. When my father revoked her access to the Vanguard accounts and permanently disinherited her, her entire world immediately collapsed. Without the endless flow of corporate capital, her luxury vehicles were repossessed within weeks. The Buckhead estate was locked and placed under 24-hour private security. Chantel tried to reach out to the extended family, desperately calling Aunt Beatrice and Jamal for financial support and a place to stay. But the flying monkeys only ever cared about proximity to power. Once they realized Chantel was completely cut off and radioactive to my father, they blocked her number and slammed their doors in her face. The very people who had championed her as the grieving heiress abandoned her the second her wallet ran dry. Today, the former golden child of Atlanta's elite works a minimum-wage retail job at a high-end department store in Phipps Plaza. It is a store where she used to demand VIP treatment and shut down entire fitting rooms for her personal use. Now she spends her days steaming designer dresses she can no longer afford and returning discarded clothes to the racks. She has to smile and offer customer service to the same wealthy socialites who watched her public execution at the church. Her social standing is permanently eradicated. She is a ghost in the very circles she once ruled, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege she weaponized against me for my entire life. I did not celebrate their ruin. I simply acknowledged it as the mathematical result of their own equations. Actions have consequences, and forensic accounting ensures those consequences are paid in full. In the wake of the church confrontation, the corporate landscape of Atlanta shifted its focus entirely to my firm. The business elite watched a 35-year-old black woman systematically dismantle a highly coordinated corporate raid and hand the perpetrators over to the federal government without raising her voice. They realized immediately that if I possessed the ruthless capability to audit and destroy my own blood relatives to protect financial integrity, I would defend their corporate assets with the exact same lethal precision. Apex Forensic Accounting exploded in growth. Within 2 months, my phone was ringing off the hook with retention offers from Fortune 500 companies, massive healthcare networks, and international supply chain conglomerates. My agency doubled its footprint. I leased an entire floor in a premier downtown high-rise and hired 12 new senior analysts to handle the massive influx of top-tier clients. I did not just build a business. I built an undeniable industry fortress entirely on my own merit, funded by my own brilliance. My father spent those 6 months undergoing a profound transition of his own. The cardiac event and the subsequent betrayal forced him to reevaluate exactly what it meant to build a legacy. He finally recognized that a logistics empire requires operators, not just heirs. He officially stepped down as the active chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics. He handed the daily operational control over to Calvin, promoting the seasoned, brilliant executive who had dedicated 30 years of his life to building the company. Calvin and the board stabilized the fleet, expanded the regional warehouses, and secured the company's future without entertaining a single predatory private equity firm. Many people in our community expected my father to hand the reins of the logistics company to me. It was the traditional narrative, the loyal daughter stepping up to claim the family throne. But my father and I understood each other perfectly. I am not a logistics manager. I do not want to route shipping trucks or negotiate union labor contracts. I am an auditor. I am an architect of protection. Instead of forcing me into a role that did not fit my expertise, my father did something unprecedented. He legally restructured his entire multi-million-dollar estate. He created the Vanguard Generational Wealth Trust, an ironclad, heavily fortified financial institution designed to manage his private real estate holdings, his investment portfolios, and his philanthropic endeavors. He named me as the sole managing director and head of the trust. I did not have to abandon my accounting firm. I integrated the trust management into my existing corporate structure. I now oversee the allocation of the community foundation funds, ensuring that every single dollar actually reaches the Black college scholars and minority entrepreneurs it was intended for. I personally audit every grant and every scholarship. The money is locked down behind biometric security and multi-signature authentication protocols. No one will ever siphon a dime from our legacy again. I am not driving the delivery trucks, I am guarding the vault. The toxicity that had drained our family for decades was permanently excised. We cut out the parasites, banished the opportunistic frauds, and silenced the extended family members who thrived on manipulation. What remained was a lean, incredibly strong foundation built entirely on mutual respect and absolute trust. It is Sunday morning. The sunlight is streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown Atlanta condo, casting a warm, golden glow across the hardwood floors. The city is quiet, the distant hum of traffic reduced to a peaceful background murmur. I am standing at my marble kitchen island, wearing comfortable sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt. I pour 2 cups of dark roast coffee, the rich aroma filling the open space. I slide one of the ceramic mugs across the smooth counter. My father is sitting right next to me. He is relaxed, wearing a casual sweater, reading the Sunday morning financial section on his tablet. There are no frantic phone calls interrupting our peace. There are no dramatic emergencies manufactured by a golden child seeking attention. There are no white saviors attempting to steal our assets. The air in the condo is light, completely free of the suffocating weight of family politics and performative expectations. My father picks up the coffee mug, taking a slow, appreciative sip. He looks up from his tablet and looks out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He looks healthy, vibrant, and completely unburdened. He turns his head and looks at me, his dark eyes radiating a quiet, profound pride that needs no translation. I take a sip of my own coffee, leaning against the marble counter. I do not have to fight for my place at the table anymore. I do not have to prove my worth or justify my independence. I built my own table, and I am sitting right next to the only man whose respect I actually value. We fought a silent, ruthless war, and we won our total freedom. We simply sip our coffee, watching the morning light wash over the city we conquered completely and absolutely at peace. The ultimate lesson from this story is that shared blood does not entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your life's work. True security is never found in seeking the approval of toxic family members or playing the quiet scapegoat. Instead, it is built through undeniable competence, absolute independence, and the courage to establish impenetrable boundaries. Kiara's journey proves that the best response to manipulation isn't loud anger. It is letting greedy people face the consequences of their own actions while you calmly protect your peace. When you build your own table, you never have to beg for a seat. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries to protect your peace from a toxic environment? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering stories.